I've traveled alone across many seas. When I stand at a shoreline, I don't pay much attention to who is nearby. I just feel the air, the breath of the sea, and when the tide begins to rise, I quietly step back. I've done this over and over again. For me, encountering indigenous cultures feels very similar. I don't always know why I'm drawn to them. I just am. And sometimes, I imagine that somewhere far beyond the water, someone else, or perhaps an animal or just a shell, is also watching quietly, that's all. But if now and then a ship passes across the water and someone waves, I have waved back. That's the kind of presence I hope to be. That is why I created the concept of the alpha layer. This layer describes how people who are not indigenous might still choose to be present, not to take, not to explain, but to stay accountable for how they witness, listen, and carry what they learn. There are 3 positions in this layer. Alpha 1, peripheral solidarity, to stay nearby without taking center, to offer support without speaking for anyone. You are present, not absent, not leading. Alpha 2, convergent praxis, to learn from many sources and begin to notice shared patterns. You're not comparing, you're weaving. You don't speak for everyone. You simply sketch a structure, one that reflects what you've seen. Alpha 3, dialogic catalyst. To be there when people who don't usually speak find themselves in the same room. You don't lead the dialogue. You don't open the space by force, but if you are invited, you may help hold the space gently and know when to step away, so it no longer depends on your presence. This too is a form of care. This is what the alpha layer offers. Not a way to take part, but a way to stand beside, with care, with caution, and with clarity. Phase 1, invasion. This phase names the beginning, not as discovery, but as intrusion. What many call first contact was often a violent entrance, through war, religion, or trade. It didn't always involve weapons. Sometimes it arrived with a Bible, a contract, or a handshake. Invasion is not only about force, but about the assumption of entitlement. It is the moment when one world enters another without permission, believing it has the right to define what it finds. I didn't create this model to speak for anyone. I created it to understand the systems I'm inside, and to take responsibility for how I move through them. Maybe I'll never fully escape the colonial frame, but I am able to choose to stop pretending I'm outside of it. This is where the map begins. Phase 2, displacement. Displacement is not just about losing land. It's about being separated from language, from ancestors, from community, from place. Sometimes it happened through forced relocation. Other times it happened through policy, assimilation, or silence. And sometimes displacement doesn't look like loss at all. Sometimes it looks like success, when someone rises within a system that was never made for them, but has to leave behind their stories, language, or name in order to survive. Sometimes families made the decision to stop passing on their language, not out of rejection, but as an act of protection. They were responding to a world that punished difference. I don't want to judge those choices. I've been shaped by systems built on displacement. So now I'm learning slowly what it means to stand somewhere without taking. These words are not meant to speak for anyone. They are part of my effort to understand how displacement travels through silence, protection, and survival, and how it leaves traces, even where no one meant harm. Phase 3, erasure. Erasure is not the same as forgetting. It is intentional. It happens when names, laws, languages, and histories are removed. Not lost, but erased. It often shows up in education, tourism, and national narratives. Sometimes it hides in a map with no indigenous place names. Sometimes it's a school textbook that mentions indigenous people only in the past tense. Sometimes it's a law that no longer exists and is treated as if it never did. I remember visiting a museum that had an entire floor dedicated to local history, but there was no mention of the people who lived there before colonization. The display began with the arrival of settlers, as if nothing had existed before that point. It didn't feel violent. It felt quiet, clean, almost natural. But that's how erasure works, not through fire, but through omission. Not by shouting, but by leaving things out until they disappear. Erasure also shapes how presence is received. Sometimes just being there, quietly, respectfully, is enough to raise suspicion. That too is how forgetting is maintained. 4. Representation. Representation is often seen as a good thing. It suggests inclusion, recognition, visibility. But when done without consent or control, it can become something else entirely. It can happen when others speak for you, in classrooms, exhibitions, books, or documentaries. When stories are told about communities, not with them. Even well-intentioned representation can reduce a culture to a symbol, a ceremony to a spectacle, a person to a lesson. I remember visiting a beautifully designed exhibition on Indigenous culture. The objects were real and the layout was elegant, but something felt missing. The narrative focused only on resilience, celebration, and shared values. There was no mention of land loss, language suppression, or resistance. I began to wonder, who is this story comforting, and who is still waiting for their version to be heard? Representation becomes problematic when it replaces listening with speaking, and when it decides what is worth remembering and what can be left out. Before I arrive anywhere, I quietly return to this phase, not to prepare a story, but to remind myself not to speak for anyone. This phase is not about me. It's where I remind myself. Don't confuse the ability to speak with the right to represent. 5. Incorporated resistance. Not all resistance happens outside the system. Some forms emerge from within, quietly, carefully, and often at risk of being misunderstood. Some in-system resistance tries to push against the structure, to ask questions that were once avoided. Others settle in, shaped by the system they hope to influence. I sometimes refer to these as breakthrough and fixed modes. They can look almost identical: a speech, a museum, a program, a performance. But the difference lies in the intention. Is it disturbing what was meant to stay stable, or confirming what the system already knows how to hold? That difference isn't always obvious. Once, in a gallery, I saw a long series of displays, and an entire section with no captions at all. It might have been intentional, or maybe the captions just hadn't arrived yet. That's how it goes sometimes. Resistance, logistics, forgetting, they all blur. Still, that absence made me pause, and sometimes that's enough. To observe moments like that, I use a quiet framework I've developed. Not to label, but to notice who is allowed to speak, what remains unspoken, and how dissent is held or erased within the form. I've learned that resistance from within rarely looks dramatic, but sometimes it leaves a trace, a hesitation, a shift in rhythm, a silence that wasn't there before. That's when I pay closer attention. 6. Cultural sovereignty. Cultural sovereignty is not about display, it's about direction. It means that Indigenous peoples run their own ceremonies, teach their own languages, and protect what doesn't need to be explained to outsiders. It resists being frozen in time because culture isn't a fossil. It lives, it changes, it decides what to carry forward. This isn't about being seen. It's about Indigenous peoples deciding how, when, and whether something is shared at all. Cultural sovereignty is not just the right to speak, but the right to stay silent and still be whole. Sometimes sovereignty looks like a quiet choice, like leaving a section of a gallery without captions. Not because there's nothing to say, but because some things remain sovereign by staying unsaid. 7. Resource sovereignty. Western sovereignty is based on ownership and control. You must live on the land, build on it, register it. But for many Indigenous peoples, sovereignty lives in relationship, in caretaking, in returning, and in knowing when not to take. In Alaska, one Indigenous community was once forced to flee when a glacier overtook their ancestral bay. They later began returning, not to settle, but to reconnect through ceremony. They built a tribal house on that shore, not to claim ownership, but to stand with memory. In another country, a river was granted legal personhood. To the people there, the river is an ancestor. They say, "I am the river, and the river is me." These are not metaphors. They are forms of sovereignty that express care, memory, and restraint. To me, these ancestral ways of seeing the world quietly ask us, who does sovereignty truly belong to? And what kind of responsibility comes with that? 8. Structural reform. I place this as phase 8 because it marks a turning point. Up until now, the phases focused on remembering, resisting, reclaiming. But here, something deeper begins to happen. When Indigenous communities start to shape the very structures that once excluded them. In Alaska, the Alutiiq have built a system where tribal members are involved from the legislative stage. They are not just responding to laws, they are helping write them. Sealaska, a native corporation in Southeast Alaska, is also using its earnings not just for business, but for education, language, policy, and cultural restoration. Their structure makes it possible to direct resources toward their own futures. These are not small changes. They signal a shift from surviving inside a system to reshaping it. Before traveling to Alaska, I exchanged messages with someone working in a tribal court. We couldn't meet in person, but I remember what they said. Don't ask us for answers. Read the law. So I did. I read a book called Alaska Natives and American Laws. It's 499 pages. I haven't finished it, but it was worth reading. Maybe that's part of the point, because structures aren't just learned, they're moved through. 9. Post-Colonial Futures. Even when structures change, something deeper often remains. A quiet wall of mistrust, a cultural reflex of protection. To be honest, I still feel worn out sometimes by the defensive reactions I encounter. I understand where they come from, but that doesn't make them easier. I don't want to bypass that pain, but I do hope we can soften the edges. To me, this final phase is not about resolving everything. It's about imagining what becomes possible when those labeled Indigenous or non-Indigenous can sit together without fear. I don't mean a future where all cultures blend. I mean a future where boundaries can exist, but still allow others to witness, to learn, and to be changed by what they've touched. Post-colonial futures are not already built. They're grown in trust, in discomfort, and in slow mutual attention. And even as I say all this, I still ask myself, is it right for me to speak here? Have I taken too much? I hope not, because I didn't speak to explain anyone's story, only to be honest about what I've seen and what I still don't fully understand.